My name is Captain Eva Rostova, and my war began not with a bang, but with a silent screaming anomaly in a stream of global biometric data. For 8 years, my world has been one of satellite feeds, drone footage, and signals intelligence. I am a reconnaissance specialist for a multinational threat assessment agency. My job is to see the shadows on the wall long before they take shape. And 12 hours ago, I saw a shadow that swallowed the world. It started at 04 Bawa Zulu, Greenwich Mean Time. I was on the night shift in a dimly lit operations center buried under Geneva. My world illuminated by the cool glow of 6 monitors. One screen tracked unusual financial movements, another monitored deep web chatter. But my primary focus was the Global Health Surveillance Network, a real-time map that tracked everything from seasonal flu outbreaks to unusual clusters of hospital admissions. At 0407, a red flag bloomed over a mid-sized city in the central United States, Springvale. It wasn't the flu. The algorithm tagged it as AG7, aggressive neurological degeneration. I'd seen alerts for new strains of meningitis, for drug-resistant encephalitis. This was different. The parameters were off the charts. Reported symptoms: extreme aggression, loss of higher cognitive function, hypersalivation, and a complete insensitivity to pain or injury. I opened a secure channel to our field asset in the region. "Orion, this is Argus. You seeing this Springvale cluster?" His response was delayed, his voice tight. "Copy, Argus, seeing it. Local news is calling it a bad batch of synthetic drugs. But the hospital intake videos, it doesn't look like an overdose, Eva. It looks like rabies on steroids." I pulled the footage, a security camera from Springvale General's ER. A man, his shirt torn, was being restrained by 4 orderlies. He was thrashing, his movements unnervingly strong and uncoordinated. His head snapped forward, and he bit down on an orderly's forearm. The bite wasn't a warning nip. It was a full-force tearing attack. The audio was a nightmare. Guttural snarls from the attacker, screams of pure agony from the victim. My training screamed one word: containment breach. This wasn't a disease. It was a weapon. I escalated it to a Priority 1 biohazard event and woke my director. By 06:00 GMT, Springvale was offline. All civilian communications, cell, internet, landlines, went dead. It was as if a black hole had opened over the city. My last drone flyover before we lost the link showed chaos in the streets. Car crashes forming impromptu barricades and figures moving in swarms. The calm was over. The first domino had fallen, and I was one of the few people on the planet who knew the chain reaction had already begun. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in systemic collapse. From my underground bunker, I watched the world bleed in real time. Springvale was patient 0, but the infection had already metastasized. It traveled along highways, on commercial flights, through the very arteries of our globalized society. A red dot bloomed in Chicago, then another in Atlanta. A flight from Springvale had landed in Frankfurt 6 hours earlier. Now a red dot pulsed there. It was a digital plague, and my screens were its fever chart. Protocol demanded a full, immediate global quarantine. It never happened. The political and economic cost was deemed too high. Governments were issuing calm, reassuring statements, urging citizens to stay home while behind the scenes. Panic was setting in. I listened in on secure channels as mayors argued with governors, as military units were put on standby but not deployed. They were treating it as a riot, a natural disaster. They didn't understand the pathogen they were facing. I did. I compiled the data. The transmission vector was clearly fluid-to-fluid contact, primarily saliva to bloodstream. The incubation period was terrifyingly short, anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours. But the most horrifying data point was the one I had to infer: 100% mortality. And I don't mean the infected died. I mean the person who was bitten was gone, irrevocably. The body kept going, but the consciousness, the soul, whatever you want to call it, was erased, replaced with a single primal drive: feed and spread. At 00 GMT, the power grid started to fail. First in Springvale, then cascading outwards. It was a cyber attack, a deliberate attempt to slow the spread by isolating populations. A desperate, brutal tactic. It also plunged millions into darkness with the enemy already inside the gates. This was the phase where my role shifted from observer to active participant. My director, His face pale on the vidlink gave me my final open-ended orders. Captain Rostova, your mission is to survive, to observe, and to report. You are now our sole remaining intelligence asset. Gather all data you can. We are ceasing centralized operations. He was bugging out. They all were. I was being left behind as the world's watchman, on a sinking ship. I acknowledged the order, my voice flat. The weight of it was immense. I was alone. My fortress was the Geneva Operations Center. It was designed to be a secure bunker, capable of withstanding a direct hit, but its defenses were built to keep things out, not to account for what was already in. The first thing I did was initiate a full lockdown. I sealed the blast doors, a foot of reinforced steel and composite, with a manual override only from the inside. I disabled the elevators and vent shafts, rerouting all life support through military-grade HEPA filters. The bunker had its own power source, a closed-loop geothermal system good for decades. For now, I had power, air, and water, but I was not a soldier. I was a specialist. My tools were keyboards and algorithms. I had a sidearm, a standard-issue Sig Sauer P226, and 3 spare magazines. 31 rounds? It felt laughably inadequate. I spent an hour doing a full inventory. The bunker had a small armory, but it required a 2-person biometric key to open. I was 1 person, so it was just me and my sidearm. My salvation was the data center itself. I had access to a global network of satellites that were, for the moment, still obediently following their programming. I had drones in hangars across the world, though I could no longer retrieve them. I had eyes, but no fists. I set up a dedicated monitor, patching into every open-source feed I could find. Traffic cameras, social media live streams, the few that were still up, amateur radio broadcasts. The story they told was one of unmitigated horror. I saw police lines being overrun by sheer weight of numbers. I saw a National Guard unit set up a 50 cal machine gun, only to be flanked by infected that moved with a terrifying, silent cunning through alleyways. One live stream from a teenager in Paris showed him barricaded in his apartment. His phone's camera pointed at the street below. He was whispering in French. Ils ne crient pas. Pourquoi ils ne crient pas? They don't scream. Why don't they scream? He was right. The infected were mostly silent, except for those wet, rasping growls. It was the living who were screaming. Then his door splintered, the stream jerked, and it went black. I was safe in my metal tomb, but I was witnessing the death of my species through a keyhole. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. The data was no longer abstract. It was blood and death. This was the end of the world, and I had a front row seat. At 13:00 GMT, the war came to my doorstep. The bunker had a secondary entrance, a discreet service access tunnel that emerged in a maintenance shed a half-kilometer away. It was a secret, hardened exit, designed for a worst-case scenario. It was also our greatest vulnerability. A proximity alarm blared, shattering the oppressive silence of the ops center. My heart leaped into my throat. The motion sensors in the service tunnel had been tripped. I pulled up the feed. The tunnel was dark, lit only by dim emergency strips. And there he was, a man in the blue jumpsuit of a Swiss maintenance worker, or what was left of him. His coveralls were drenched in something dark, and one of his arms hung at a grotesque angle. He wasn't walking. He was lurching, his head twitching, bouncing off the walls as he moved down the tunnel towards my inner blast door. He must have been infected, stumbled into the shed, and fallen down the access shaft. It was a 1 in a million event, a catastrophic 1 in a million event. I watched him on the monitor, my hand on my Sig Sauer. The blast door was strong, but was it strong enough? Could he get through? The rational part of my brain said no. The part of my brain that had just watched cities fall wasn't so sure. He reached the door. He didn't pound on it. He pressed his face against the cold steel, his mouth working, smearing a dark residue across the metal. He started to make a sound, a low, rhythmic thump, 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 as he rocked his body against the door. It was a testing, probing action. It was horrifyingly patient. This was my first real-time observation of the infected. I forced my training to take over, compartmentalizing the terror. I began dictating notes into my log, my voice a shaky but clinical monotone. Subject displays no apparent pain response to its own injuries. Motor functions are impaired but functional. Vocalization is subvocal, a guttural rasp. Behavior appears investigative, testing the integrity of the barrier. No signs of pack coordination yet. As if on cue, a second figure appeared on the camera feed. A woman in a business suit, one high heel missing. She joined the first at the door. Then a third, a fourth. They were coming. Drawn by the noise or by some other sense I didn't understand, the thump, thump, thump became a chorus. They were no longer testing the door. They were trying to get in. I had to make a choice. I was safe for now, but my only escape route was compromised. I was trapped. I had 31 rounds, and there were now at least 10 of them at my door. The watchman was in the tower, and the wolves were at the gate. The thudding against the blast door was a constant, maddening drumbeat. It was the sound of my prison walls closing in. I couldn't think, couldn't focus with that noise, and every thud meant more of them were gathering. My fortress was becoming my tomb. I had one option, a destructive one. During the bunker's construction, charges were placed in the service tunnel. The purpose was denial. If the bunker was ever overrun, we could collapse the tunnel to prevent the enemy from accessing the sensitive equipment inside. It was a last resort, meant for a conventional enemy. I was about to use it on a handful of infected, sealing my only known exit. It was the tactically sound decision. The tunnel was a liability. Sever it, isolate the infection, but it felt like I was amputating my own limb to escape a trap. I pulled up the demolition control interface. It required 2 command codes and a biometric scan. I had the authority. My hand hovered over the arm button. On the monitor, the crowd at the door had grown to maybe 15. They were a writhing, pressing mass of dead flesh and relentless hunger. I thought of the data. The live feeds from around the world were dwindling fast, but the patterns were clear. The infected were drawn to sound, to movement, to the heat and scent of the living. By collapsing the tunnel, I would create a massive, concussive boom. It would attract every single infected for miles around to my location. I would be surrounded but safe behind my foot of steel. It was a trade-off. Immediate security for long-term siege. I took a deep breath. This is Captain Eva Rostova, Argus Actual. Initiating Protocol Karen on Service Tunnel Alpha. Reason: containment breach. I typed the codes, pressed my thumb to the scanner, and hit the button. A countdown timer appeared on the screen. 10. 9. 8. I switched the camera view to an external satellite, focusing on the ground above the service tunnel. It was a parkland on the outskirts of Geneva. 3, 2, when the screen showing the tunnel feed turned to static. On the satellite view, a geyser of dirt and concrete erupted silently in the park. The ground collapsed in on itself. The drumbeat at my door stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sound I had ever heard. I had solved one problem and created a much larger one. I was now the prize in the center of a labyrinth, and I had just announced my location to every Minotaur in Switzerland. My fate was sealed. There would be no leaving this bunker, not for a very, very long time. The first hour after the explosion was spent in absolute vigilance. I monitored every sensor, every satellite feed I could muster around my new epicenter. As predicted, they came. From the city, from the countryside, drawn by the sound of the blast. They shambled and lurched into the park, a slow, relentless tide of the dead converging on the collapsed crater. Within 2 hours, there were hundreds. By nightfall, thousands. I was at the center of a swarm. My bunker was an island in a sea of death. This was the phase of psychological attrition. The immediate, active threat was gone, replaced by a passive, omnipresent one. I was safe, but I was buried alive. The reality of my situation settled in with the weight of a mountain. I had to establish a routine. A mission. My orders were to observe and report. So, that's what I did. I became a scholar of the apocalypse. I designated Monitor 1 for global strategic view, tracking the spread of the blackouts, the fall of major cities. Monitor 2 was for local, tactical, a mosaic of every camera and sensor I had within a 10-kilometer radius, watching the horde. Monitor 3 was for data analysis, running models on infection rates, movement patterns. I learned their behaviors. I categorized them. Shamblers were the majority, the slow, decaying baseline. Runners were the freshly turned, still possessing a horrifying speed and agility. And then there were the stalkers, the ones that didn't moan or shamble, but stood perfectly still for hours, almost as if in ambush. They were the most frightening, because they hinted at a vestigial cunning I didn't want to acknowledge. To maintain my sanity, I began broadcasting. I set up a looped, low-frequency signal, broadcasting on all emergency and military bands. This is Captain Eva Rostova, call sign Argus. Geneva bunker is active. I am a surviving intelligence asset. The event is global. Repeat, the event is global. Casualty estimates, incalculable. I will continue to broadcast and gather data. To anyone who can hear this, you are not alone. I never got a response. The silence on the radio was as deep as the silence in my bunker. I was screaming into a void, hoping another voice would scream back. None ever did. The loneliness was a physical ache. I was surrounded by the ghosts of my colleagues, their half-finished coffee cups still on their desks. I was the sole witness, to the end of everything, and the burden of that knowledge was crushing me. 12 hours. It felt like a lifetime. The world I knew was gone. My old mission was over. There was no one left to report to. I sat in my commander's chair, the glow of the monitors the only light in the vast, dark ops center. On one screen, a live feed from a satellite showed the Earth at night. The familiar, brilliant tapestry of city lights was gone. The continents were outlined in darkness, punctuated only by a few, faint clusters of light, isolated pockets of humanity, or perhaps just raging fires with no one left to put them out. I was a relic, an artifact from a dead civilization, my purpose obsolete. I pulled up the personnel files of my team. I looked at their photos, their service records. They had families, hobbies, dreams, all of it erased. A wave of grief, hot and overwhelming, finally broke through my professional detachment. I put my head in my hands and wept for them, for everyone. When the tears were spent, I felt hollowed out, but clearer. I looked at the screens again. The data was still flowing. The satellites were still watching. The infected were still moving. My old mission was dead, but a new one was being born from its ashes. I was not just a watchman. I was an archivist. I was the memory of the world that was. And perhaps if anyone survived, I could be a guide for the world that would be. I opened a new log file. I began to type. Not a tactical report for a superior, but a record for the future. A history of the fall. Log entry, Captain Eva Rostova. Day 1. The global collapse event, designated Thanatos Cascade, is complete. Human civilization, as a cohesive entity, has ceased to exist. The dominant species on Earth is now Homo sapiens mortuus, or the infected. Their behavioral patterns are as follows. I would document everything. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their patterns. I would map the safe zones, the dead zones, the resource caches. I would use my eyes in the sky to find other survivors, to see if any form of order was rising from the chaos. The first 12 hours were about survival. The next 12, and all the hours after, would be about purpose. I was no longer just a recon specialist who survived. I was the one who remembered. And as long as I drew breath and the satellites obeyed my commands, I would bear witness. The spark of knowledge had not been extinguished. It was here, with me, buried under a mountain, waiting for the dawn.